nation based on an idea. And the root of our problem today, the division that exists in America today, is grounded in the fact that you have people all over the country who believe in diametrically opposed and fundamentally incompatible ideas about just government. The people who authored the Constitution and defended it and supported it did so because they believed it served a higher principle. And that higher principle is embodied in the Declaration and is best stated, as Abraham Lincoln puts it, in the concept of liberty to all. America is in a situation that it has found itself in before. In the years leading up to the American Civil War, we were a nation that was divided between two fundamentally different moral principles. One of the things that Lincoln understood was that we were going to have to make a choice, and we're going to have to make a choice today.
Hello, my name is Sophie. I'm a junior majoring in political economy and history at Hillsdale College. This is a part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today you'll hear from Dr. Kevin Porteous, Assistant Professor of Politics, on Abraham Lincoln and the Constitution. Please watch.
This is the second of two talks where we are going to focus on the political thought and statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln. I was asked to talk about Abraham Lincoln and the Constitution, which is an incredibly broad topic. We could spend weeks on it. When I teach the course, we spend essentially the second half of an entire semester talking about Lincoln and the Constitution and all of the various wrinkles in Lincoln's constitutional thought and all of the problems of his presidency, how he understood executive power, how he understood things like habeas corpus, emancipation, war power, and so on. But obviously we don't have half a semester in which to cover this material. And so what we need to do then is to focus on the most important aspect of Lincoln's understanding of the Constitution. And so what I'd like to do then is to talk to you today a little bit about Lincoln's understanding of the relationship between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. This was, I think, the central, primary, guiding way in which Lincoln understood the Constitution. He understood the Constitution as being the embodiment or the fulfillment of the principles established in the Declaration of Independence. In order to do that, what I'd like to do is to walk you through one of Lincoln's lesser-known documents, one of his lesser-known writings. It never got published. It never appeared in print. He never gave it as a speech. He never wrote it as a letter. It was one of those things that Lincoln wrote, as he frequently did, for his own edification, in order to clarify his own thoughts. It's referred to as the fragment on the Constitution and the Union. And so we'll read a section of it, and then what I want to do is to show you how the various themes that he talks about in that small fragment manifest themselves in his more public thought. Right? So Lincoln believed that one had to interpret the Constitution in light of the Declaration of Independence in order to understand the Constitution correctly. And I think that's massively important for our own understanding of the Constitution. Okay, so in the first paragraph of this fragment, he says, all this, meaning the nation, is not the result of accident. It has a philosophical cause. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result. But even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. And there are a number of themes here that become apparent when we start to walk through that paragraph. Right? I think the first one of these, and this is an ongoing theme in American politics, is the idea of American exceptionalism. When Lincoln addresses Congress at the outbreak of the Civil War, he sends a message over to Congress explaining what has happened, the Sumter crisis, the outbreak of the war, since Congress had last met. And he explains the policy of his administration, And he talks about the measures that he's taken and the measures that he thinks will need to be taken going forward. And he says, this is not just about us. This is not just about the present crisis of the Union. He says, this issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. That is to say, are we capable of holding ourselves together, of maintaining our national existence, right, in the face of a formidable attempt to break up the nation? And it's in the sense that it's not just about us. Right? He's echoing here a theme that we see in the first paragraph of the first essay of The Federalist, where Alexander Hamilton says that it seems to have been left to the people of this country to determine whether or not it is possible to form governments according to reflection and choice, or whether or not all mankind is doomed to have governments established by accident and force. The situation for the success of self-government is so favorable here in the United States that if it can't work here, what hope does the rest of the world have? So, it's not just about maintaining our own existence as a nation. It's about proving to mankind that a free, self-governing country can maintain its own existence and yet remain free. He wants to prove to the world that self-government is not doomed to either be so strong that it overwhelms the rights of the people or so weak that it's incapable of surviving. He says, this conflict, this civil war, will determine that. Right? Okay, so there's this theme then that America is something special. Right? There's also the theme that the Union is older than the Constitution. Right? That we existed as a nation before there was a Constitution. A Constitution is important, as we shall see going forward. Right? But there was something else. There was something more fundamental than the Constitution that made us one people. So in his first inaugural address, when he's attacking the constitutional legitimacy of secession, Lincoln says, the Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. It was matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was further matured, and the faith of all the then 13 states expressly plighted and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation in 1778. And finally, in 1787, one of the declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was, quote, to form a more perfect union. Now, the phrase more perfect implies that a union existed prior to the Constitution. What was the basis for that union? Well, go back to Lincoln's quote. He says, right, that our union was matured by the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence formed, in Lincoln's mind, the fullest expression of who we are as a people. Right? The moral principle that unites us and makes us one. The thing that makes us unique. The thing that is the basis of American exceptionalism. The fact that we are based not simply on a set of laws, but on an idea, a principle, a moral truth. During the conflict with Douglas in 1858, as they were both running for the Senate, Lincoln was seeking Stephen Douglas's Senate seat. He gave a speech in Chicago, Illinois. And in that, he explained how it is that this idea is what binds us together as a single people. So he talks about the Founding Fathers and all of the great things that the founding generation did. And he says, we have, besides these men, descended by blood from our ancestors, among us perhaps half our people who are not descendants at all of these men. They are men who have come from Europe, men that have come from Europe themselves or whose ancestors have come hither and settled here finding themselves our equals in all things. If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are a part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration, and so they are. We are unique. We are special because we are united, we are made one people by our common commitment to a moral truth. The truth, Lincoln says, returning to that fragment on the Constitution of the Union, the truth of liberty to all. My own advisor when I was in college is a Hungarian immigrant. And he and his family escaped from Hungary during the failed anti-communist revolution in 1956. He was about 10 years old at the time. His father had been in trouble with both the Nazis during their time in power and with the communists. And when the time came, they decided it was their time to go. And he tells this story beautifully. He says, we made our way from Hungary into Austria. And there we met up with officials of the West German government, like many other refugees. And we have a German name. Right? We don't have a Hungarian name. And so he said, the West Germans offered us citizenship on the spot. And they thought about taking it. Okay? And ultimately they refused. And they took their chances on coming to America, where they knew nobody and nothing about the culture or anything of that nature. Right? And as he tells it, his father explained to them, we were born Americans. We were just born in the wrong place. Right? That is to say, right, anyone who believes in these principles, right, and who is sincerely committed to living according to them, can, in theory, be an American. It's not like being a German or a Frenchman or someone from Japan, where common blood is essential to common citizenship. Very few of us today are united by blood descent from those original men of the Revolution. I certainly am not. But we can all be a part of that regime, of that people, if we believe in it. And that makes us different. That makes us special. Right? And the Constitution, then, is simply the expression of how we intend to govern ourselves according to those principles. Lincoln elsewhere describes that principle as the ancient faith that defines who we are. So in one of his more famous speeches in 1854 in Peoria, Illinois, right, he uses this understanding of a moral principle as being our foundation as the way in which we understand, the way in which we are able to discern that slavery is wrong, and that all those who stop short of embracing the natural equality, the equality under the natural law of natural rights and natural obligations, are incorrect in their understanding of the American regime. He says, if the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. And so, in Lincoln's time, there was the obvious argument in favor of slavery as a positive good, which he clearly rejected. Right? But there was also a more insidious argument. Lincoln in those days, in the 1850s, was directing most of his rhetorical and intellectual strength against Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was one of the most famous and noted and accomplished politicians in America in the 1850s. Comparatively speaking, Lincoln was a nobody. He was a one-term congressman, right, who rotated out of office according to a prearranged agreement and then went back into private life, right, and was an attorney mostly representing railroads. Right? And so he takes on, right, the man who was called the Little Giant, and his doctrine of popular sovereignty. See, Douglas's solution to the slavery problem was, let the people of an area decide. Right? And what Lincoln said about that was, right, that presumes that there can be some kind of moral right to slavery, that slavery and freedom are moral equivalents. Right? And if one reads strictly the Constitution, independently of the Declaration, one may be able to accept that line of argument. One may be able to accept Chief Justice Taney's assertion that the right of property in slaves is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. There are provisions in the Constitution, right, that seem to protect the right of property in slaves. Right? And if one looks simply at the strict letter of the Constitution, it's very hard to argue one's way out of it. Lincoln says, if you return to the Declaration, then you know that those provisions are not statements of principle, that somehow there is a moral right in connection with slavery, but that they are merely compromises with necessity. We had to tolerate an evil in order to avoid a greater evil, the evil of disunion. Right. Let's turn our attention then back to the fragment on the Constitution and the Union and think about the second paragraph and work through some ideas in there. He says, the expression of that principle, meaning the principle of liberty to all, in our Declaration of Independence was most happy and fortunate. Without this, as well as with it, we could have declared our independence of Great Britain, but without it we could not, I think, have secured our free government and consequent prosperity. No oppressed people will fight and endure, as our fathers did, without the promise of something better than a mere change of masters. So what's going on here? Right? Lincoln understands that the fact that these moral principles were inserted into our founding through the Declaration of Independence, right, was not necessary to the immediate task of establishing our independence. What was necessary was to succeed in the military struggle, right? To overcome the physical opposition of the British government and the British Empire. That's what was immediately necessary. So why put it there? He says in his speech on the Dred Scott decision, the assertion that all men are created equal was of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain, and it was placed in the Declaration not for that, but for future use. Its authors meant it to be, thank God, it is now proving itself a stumbling block to those who in after times would seek to turn a free people back into the hateful paths of despotism. They knew the proneness of prosperity to breed tyrants, and they meant that when such should reappear in this fair land and commence their vocation, they should find left for them at least one hard nut to crack. That there would be something standing in their way. And it's important to realize that the situation for the opponents of slavery in the 1850s, when Lincoln was speaking and writing these words, was desperate. The Constitution had been turned against freedom. There were widely accepted and plausible interpretations of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document that were held not just by Southerners who supported slavery, but by Northern abolitionists who opposed slavery. They shared the common belief that the Constitution was the instrument of slavery. In the South, the Bible was being turned against freedom. And preachers ran hither and yon throughout the South, right, using Scripture as a justification for the institution of slavery. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave who later became a prominent abolitionist, said that the worst masters he ever had were those who had pretensions to religion, because they believed that they were on the side of God. The law and the faith had been turned against freedom. The only thing that was left to the defenders of freedom was the language of the Declaration of Independence. It was the last redoubt. It was the last stumbling block. Okay? It was the last way to interpret the Constitution and the laws in a way that supported the cause of freedom. Without them, literally shudder to think where we would have ended up in the slavery controversy. Okay, so this view then, right, of slavery as being unconstitutional because it's contrary to our fundamental principle of liberty to all was under assault during Lincoln's time. In a very famous speech, John C. Calhoun, the theoretician of Southern rights, of secession, of nullification, says there's no such thing as liberty. There's no such thing as equality, as being natural. Liberty is a reward. Right? Liberty is the reward given to those who are capable of exercising it. It is emphatically not a birthright. Right? And that the greatest mistake the founders ever made was to say that all men are created equal. He refers to the idea that all men are born free and equal as the most false and dangerous of all political errors. Right? And then he goes on to establish a new understanding of politics wherein some people are just inferior and have to be governed. Right? And we govern them not just for the good of the governors, but for the good of the slaves themselves. Right? It is a positive good that we rule them in this way, for us and for them. All right. Returning to the fragment and returning to what we see in the fragment. Why is the Union worth defending in the Civil War? Lincoln tells us. At about the same time he's writing this fragment on the Constitution and the Union, he gives a speech to the New Jersey Senate. This takes place during his trip from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington to take the oath, right, and enter into the presidency. He says, I am exceedingly anxious that this Union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which the revolutionary struggle was made. Right? That is to say, the thing is worth preserving. Right? The Constitution is worth preserving because of the higher ideas that it embodies. It's good law. But it's good law because it serves a good purpose. Not simply because we like it. It's what we've had for a long time. It's our tradition. That's not enough. Right? It serves a higher good, a higher purpose. And so this in turn then, the idea of the Constitution as embodying the ideal of liberty to all expressed in the Declaration, forms the basis of Lincoln's argument that secession on the part of the South in 1860 and 1861 is illegitimate. They are looking to set up their own country precisely so that they can violate the rights of other human beings. That's the root cause of the Southern attempt to break away. He says in the first inaugural address that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances. Now, what are the circumstances? What is the difference between insurrection and revolution? Well, if you recall our discussion about the Declaration of Independence, you know that revolution is a specific natural right of all human beings. But the only time one can legitimately engage or exercise the right of revolution to overthrow one's government is when that government is systematically depriving you of your God-given natural rights. And so the question arises, are the Southerners rebelling against the government in order to protect their natural rights? And once one examines it in that context, the answer becomes pretty clearly no. Right? Lincoln goes on to say that if by the mere force of numbers a majority should deprive a minority of any clearly written constitutional right, it might, in a moral point of view, justify revolution. Certainly would, if such right were a vital one. But he goes on to say that the North is making no effort to deprive anyone of any plainly written right. So that, why are they revolting? Why are they attempting to break away and set up their own country? We have to make that evaluation in order to determine whether or not they are legitimately trying to exit the Union. What right is it that they seek? And when one gets past all of the arguments, right, and all of the smokescreens that Southerners after the war put up, what one realizes is that they are attempting to set up their own nation for the express purpose of holding other human beings as chattel property. And we know from even the most cursory reading of the Declaration that there can be no right, natural right, moral right, to hold other human beings as property. And so we know then that the purpose for which the South is attempting to break away is not legitimate. Right? That they have no revolutionary right to exit the Union in this way. And so Lincoln says what we're left with then is an insurrection, an armed rebellion against legitimate authority that is without foundation. Lincoln says, if you Southerners want to change the way the system works, if the people are fed up with the constitutional order, then they can do one of two things. They can exercise their constitutional right to change the system, and there's a way to change the system. Article 5 of the Constitution provides an amendment process. That is the only legitimate constitutional way out. There's also the revolutionary way out. If you think the system can't be reformed and needs to be overthrown and replaced, then you can exercise your revolutionary right to overthrow the Constitution. The Southerners are arguing for is a constitutional right to overthrow the Constitution. That doesn't exist. Right? They're arguing for a constitutional right to overthrow the Constitution for the purpose of sustaining a massive violation of the rights of millions of other human beings. Right? That is not legitimate grounds for changing the system under the theory of the American founding. Okay. Let's look at the third paragraph then of this fragment on the Constitution and the Union. Lincoln says, the assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. Now, this is one of Lincoln's most famous biblical allusions. He is referring here to the 25th chapter of Proverbs, the 11th verse, which reads that a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. And so he uses that metaphor, right, that allusion, to try and understand and to try and help us understand the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution. So he views the principle embodied in the Declaration then as an apple of gold. And the Union and the Constitution are the picture or the frame that is subsequently built around it. Okay? So take that allusion and extend it. Right? Which one is more valuable? Well, obviously, gold is more valuable in and of itself than silver. Now, this is not to say that silver is without value, right? If somebody drives a truckload of silver up to your house, you're not going to send them away, right? Silver has value, and particularly so when it is formed and shaped to a particular purpose. Right? A lump of silver sitting on your dinner table is valuable. But when that lump of silver has been beaten and formed and shaped and carved into a silver serving set, it is much more valuable. And so too here. Right? Government, the Constitution and the Union are valuable in and of themselves, but they are of particular value because they have been formed and shaped to suit a particular purpose. One goes to an auction and comes home with a beautiful Rembrandt, right, which one purchased at the auction. And you get home, and you take a look around, and you say, you know what, before I went, I bought a frame at Walmart for this thing, but it doesn't fit. Now what? Right? Well, the obvious answer is, well, I'm not going to get a knife and go after my Rembrandt and make it fit the frame I bought for $12 at Walmart. I think I'm going to go to a framing studio and get this done nicely. Right? We're horrified by stories of what happened to old paintings. Right? Rembrandt's The Night Watch, possibly his most famous painting, was something like a third larger than it is today. Somebody in the 18th century owned it, wanted to put it somewhere. It didn't fit, so he literally just took a pair of scissors and chopped the thing until it fit the space. Right? And we are horrified by that, and we should be. Right? Because that represents a very bizarre inversion of priorities. Right? And a very corrupted understanding of what is most important. What's most important is not the frame, but the painting itself. Right? What's inside the frame. Right? The frame exists to preserve and adorn the contents. Right? The Constitution and the Union exist. Returning back to our political history, the Constitution and the Union exist and were formed in order to serve a particular purpose, the purpose of preserving and adorning the principle of liberty to all, which is embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Now, people need to be reminded of this fact frequently. At the outset of probably his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And if you look at that 77 and realize that that's 87 years, and you walk that back from 1863, when Lincoln is giving the speech, you arrive in 1776. Our nation was brought into being when we committed ourselves to a moral principle. Later on, after much trial and error, we devised the Constitution as the most effective system of government to serve that higher purpose. And that declaration in Lincoln's mind must guide our thinking. In his other very famous speech, the second inaugural address, in the concluding paragraph, you're all familiar with the phrase, with malice toward none, with charity for all. But he goes on to say, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. God allows us to see a part of his law. That law, Lincoln believed, the part that we were allowed to see, was expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Things like the natural equality of all human beings before God, the equality of their rights, their liberty. Right? That must guide our thinking. Right? And it must guide our understanding of how we choose to govern ourselves. He concludes with a couple of very short statements that are worth noting in the fragment on the Constitution and the Union. He says, so let us act that neither picture or apple shall ever be blurred or bruised or broken. That the two are inseparable from one another. That the two are connected. And that we must protect both. We cannot consider the Constitution independently of the purpose for which it was designed to serve. And so we must make sure that we understand what the Constitution is, where it comes from, why it was written, what purpose does it serve. Final line of Lincoln's fragment is, that we may so act, we must study and understand the cause of danger. Study and understand the points of danger. We have a problem today. In many ways, it's the same problem we had in Lincoln's time. In Lincoln's time, we had gone from becoming a nation committed to the principle of liberty to all to, in a way, drifting towards becoming two nations. We had part of the country that was more or less vaguely committed to the idea of freedom. It may have been imperfectly understood. They may have disagreed about what it meant, but they were committed to the idea of freedom broadly stated and opposed to slavery. And we had another half of the country that had utterly turned its back on our original idea and developed the thought that slavery is not an evil, but is a positive good, that it is the basis of civilization. Right? And it is the basis of freedom for those who are fortunate enough to be entitled to freedom, to have earned their freedom. Right? And so Lincoln, in his most politically powerful speech and politically consequential speech, says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." This is a reference to both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become either all one thing or all the other." Today, we are a nation that is half committed to the principles of the American founding and the constitutionalism that flows from it, and half committed to the principles of progressivism and of the modern state. It is unclear, just as it was unclear in 1858, whether or not we would return to our original principle, or we would take the last steps down the road of becoming a slave nation altogether. And Lincoln asked rhetorically in the House Divided speech, "Have we no tendency toward the latter condition?" Are we not moving in the direction of being an all-slave nation? Take a look around at the situation as it presents itself today. Are we not moving in the direction of becoming a nation that is thoroughly committed to the principles of progressivism and to plainly and clearly reject the original idea of liberty to all that's embodied in the founding? It seems to me that we are in a very significant way exactly where we were in 1858, in Lincoln's own time. That tells us where we're headed. That's the point of danger, our movement towards becoming a progressive nation, our movement away from the founding. What do we do about it? Lincoln says in the House Divided speech, "Our cause, then, must be entrusted to and conducted by its own undoubted friends, those whose hands are free, whose hearts are in the work, who do care for the result." Unquote. And he's referring here, of course, to his rival, Stephen Douglas, who had taken the position that we should just allow the people to decide, whatever they want. Lincoln says, this man is not a friend of liberty. And we should resist the temptation, right, to legal solutions, like just letting the people decide, that are not grounded in moral principle. And so, as people who are committed to constitutional government, we are in the same position. If we are going to restore constitutional government, and I assume that that's why you've all tuned in, if we are going to restore constitutional government, then that work can only be entrusted to the true friends of constitutional government, those whose hearts are in the work. And as Lincoln elaborates in the course of the fragment, what makes the work worthwhile, what clears the path for all, if you'll recall, what gives hope to all, is the fact not simply that we have a constitution, which is important, but that we have a constitution that is animated by a moral principle, the idea of liberty to all.